Some of y'all were here last August, and I did a program on the construction of Tyler State Park by the CCC. And I touched on this topic just a little bit on the desegregation of the state park and sort of promised you I'd get back to it with a lot more detail. And so this is the fulfillment of that. So if you were here in August, some of this will overlap a little bit, but it'll go on from there. Am I picking up on okay, good. Tyler State Park was born in the heart of East Texas and in the midst of the Jim Crow era 80 years ago this past summer in 1934. 4 levels of government, city, county, state, and federal, came together to preserve some of the natural beauty of this section for the pleasure, the benefit, and the recreation for the citizens of East Texas. Unspoken was the definition of the word citizens, because from the beginning, African American residents of Smith and surrounding counties would be unwelcome at the park. Protests by local civil rights leaders, backed by the NAACP, pushed the desegregation of Tyler State Park to the forefront of opening all state recreational facilities to at least separate but equal access. However, it would take the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to bring down the signs marking these facilities for whites and those over there for blacks. The earliest request for access to the park came before it was even completed. In July 1939, the white county agent in Smith County, Elbert Gentry, contacted A.W. Turner, the park superintendent, requesting permission for the black county and home demonstration agents to bring their 4-H club boys and girls out for their annual encampment. He was referred to the State Parks Board in Austin. B.G. Link replied for the board, "If this is a colored group, we do not have an area in the park to take care of any colored organization whatsoever." A year later, the issue came up again. Mike Matisse, the new park manager, wrote Link that a Negro professor named J.M. Hilliard Jr. of the Texas College here was in today asking permission to have a picnic in the park June 19th. I told him that we had never had any colored people in the park, therefore it would be necessary for me to find out more of this. In a letter marked confidential race problem, Link replied, "Please explain to the Negro heading this group diplomatically that you feel it would not be wise to mix the races of the people at the park, and further that no picnic areas have been provided for the colored race. In explaining this, please do so without quoting the Texas State Parks Board, as frankly, there is no possible way the board can prevent them from coming into the park. But we certainly do not want this to happen. Due to this fact, we are going to depend on your own good judgment and discretion to handle this situation so that the Negroes will not bring any pressure on the board for the use of these facilities." Less than a week later, Matisse wrote Link again. "Mr. Bryant called me today to tell me some Negro called on him about going to the park and that he told him he must see me. We found out he worked for the Citizens National Bank. I at once contacted the Vice President, Henry Bell, who I'm sure has stopped that for good. I put a stop to the one I wrote you about." By the latter part of World War II, the power of the state-level NAACP had grown to the point of being able to defeat the white Democratic primary in 1944, as well as beginning the assault on segregated public education with Sweat versus Painter. In 1949, the organization turned to the state park system. Tyler seemed a good place to start, with local black leadership focused around 2 African American colleges, Texas College and Butler College, strong churches, and wealthy businessman Henry M. Morgan, owner of a chain of barber colleges, as well as former president of the Texas Conference of Branches, NAACP, which had had a chapter in Tyler for 13 years. In March of 1949, W.A. Palmer, Jr., recently hired manager of Tyler State Park, started noticing blacks occasionally entering the facility, usually sitting in their cars in various picnic areas. He approached them and in a polite manner, asked them if they knew they were not supposed to be in the park. Their reply invariably was no, and without any disturbance or provocation, they would leave. Some would drive through the park and not stop. Then, probably in April, 3 men came to Palmer's office and introduced themselves as being a committee from the Tyler Negro Chamber of Commerce. They were Thomas R. Register, Reverend J.W. Presley, and Dr. Peyton E. Madlock. Thomas R. Register, 53, was a veteran of World War I, a representative of the Universal Life Insurance Company, president of the Negro Chamber of Commerce, and a member of the NAACP, the Voters League, the Price Fennell Post of the American Legion, and Bethlehem Baptist Church. J.W. Presley served as the pastor of Bethlehem Baptist, as well as other congregations in East Texas before and after this incident. Dr. Peyton E. Madlock, 49, practiced dentistry in Tyler. He was also active in the Boy Scouts, the Negro Chamber of Commerce, the NAACP, Voters League, Tyler Organization of Men, Alpha Phi Alpha, and Miles Chapel CME Church, and served on the board of Texas College. These were outstanding, middle-aged citizens of Tyler. They were not kids, they were not radical college students. These were the foundation of black society in Tyler. Register asked Palmer how the fishing was going. He replied, "It's all right." Register then asked me if Negroes were allowed to fish in the lake, and I told him no. He then asked me if they were allowed to picnic, and I told him no. He then asked me if this was a state park, and I told him yes. And he asked if the park was maintained by taxpayers' money. And I answered yes and no, that our park was more or less self-supporting. He asked me why Negroes could not fish there, and I told him I did not know, that I assumed it was on account of a segregation law, and I was just the park manager hired to do a job, and that the best thing for him to do was to take his proposition up with Mr. Gordon Shearer, who was the executive secretary of the Parks Board. I gave him Mr. Shearer's name and address. On April 19th, Register, representing the Tyler Negro Chamber of Commerce, did write Shearer in regards to the restrictions at Tyler State Park. It is our understanding that this lake park was built by our government and state funds for the use and benefits of the citizens of Smith County and the state of Texas, who are taxed for its maintenance, but the Negro race is not allowed to exercise or enjoy any of the privileges of that said lake park offer. Yet, we, as all other citizens, were taxed for its construction. They were not asking for swimming privileges at this point, only fishing privileges. Shearer replied that Negro use of the state park facilities at Tyler State Park is not permitted, and I am sure you will realize that it would be impossible for several reasons. When the park was constructed, there was no provision for segregated toilets, and it would endanger public health to permit use of the park by persons for whom no sanitary facilities had been provided. There is always the possibility of a clash occurring between park patrons if the park is used by members of the white and Negro races. There is no adequate park staff to handle such a situation. He suggested that they contact the U.S. Engineers Office to set aside areas for black parks as part of their river and harbors work. The State Parks Board had spoken to the Lower Colorado River Authority in favor of a park there, which was many hundred miles from Smith County. This was followed up by a letter from U. Simpson Tate, Regional Special Counsel for the NAACP, on May 11th. He acknowledged Shearer's letter and added, "As we understand it, the Texas State Park Board has authority to provide park facilities for the general public. Where the state undertakes to provide facilities for the general public, if it insists upon the luxury of segregation, it must assume the burden of providing at any cost equal accommodations for the persons or group segregated. It appears that the Texas State Park Board has authority to make such rules and regulations as are necessary to perform its lawful duty, so long as its rules and regulations are not in conflict with the law. If your letter is declarative of the rules and regulations of the Texas State Park Board, its rules and regulations are clearly in conflict with the law, and they are therefore void." Let's see if we get that. There's that letter, and then a copy of the letter went to Price Daniels, Attorney General. The news soon hit the national African American press. On May 28, 1949, the Chicago Defender ran, "Impossible to admit Negroes," says Texas Park official, "suit expected." As D. Frederick wrote, "The ludicrous and devious bypass of logic into which racial prejudice forces the average Southern white man was illustrated here this week by Shearer's reply to Register. What principally arouses amusement is that Shearer is a well-known states writer and did, and would scream himself purple at the horrible notion that the pious South cannot handle its own Negro problem without federal intervention, but would ask the federal government to provide parks for black Texans." The State Parks Board remained committed to segregated parks and yet conceded that they did not have the funds to build separate parks for African Americans. The NAACP offered to be still if Tyler State Park would allow the use of one undeveloped end of the lake by blacks for fishing and picnicking, but the Parks Board declined. On December 4th, 1949, Tate, at a statewide black youth meeting in Austin, announced that a lawsuit would be filed within the week against the State Parks Board. Simpson said segregation is not legal in theaters, public eating places, and places of public assembly. Segregation, he said, can be enforced by law only on public carriers, in schools, and in marriages. Most segregation in Texas has been accepted on the basis of custom and tradition, he said. We intend to whop segregation in the open courts, and there isn't a child in Texas who doesn't know that segregation is at the very moment in dire trouble. The next day, Shearer told the press that the State Parks Board was seeking federal aid through the U.S. Army engineers to build Negro public parks. Possible sites included the Sabine-Neches area, Whitney Dam, and Lake Texoma. But it was not enough. On December 29th, Register, Presley, and Madlock of Tyler, along with W. Astor Kirk, a professor at Tillotson College in Austin and a native of Harrison County, filed suit against the State Parks Board in the Western Federal District Court in Austin to end segregation at Tyler State Park and all other state parks. The case would be known as Register versus Sandifer. U.S. District Judge Ben Rice delayed hearing the case to give the state a chance to show a real effort to equalize park facilities for whites and Negroes during the special session beginning on January 31st. The legislature reaffirmed segregation, however, of state parks in the interest of public welfare, safety, harmony, health, and recreation, and declared that separate facilities shall be furnished in the system of state parks for the white and Negro races, and impartial provision shall be made for both races. It also gave the park board authority to close any state park where separate equal facilities for the races could not be furnished. However, no funds for additional facilities were included. The new law did prompt the board to study segregation as practiced across the state parks. They requested that each park manager report back on how many blacks had asked to enter and how those requests had been handled. And it turned out that there was no statewide policy in place. Each park manager handled admittance his own way, from totally equal access at Gonzales to absolute denial at Tyler, Lockhart, and Fort Griffin. In his report, Tyler's W.A. Palmer related several other instances after the initial visit of Register, Presley, and Madlock in which he had to deal with African American visitors. He estimated that on at least 12 occasions he spotted cars in the park, and 4 times he was able to stop them at the entrance. In late May 1949, just prior to the end of the school year, 2 large buses from Rice School District, which was a common school district at the time, segregated schools, where Rice is now, they were loaded with black children, and they pulled in. Palmer followed them on down to about the center of the park, and they made a circle as if they were coming out. And I stopped the buses and talked to the driver in the lead. I told him that the park was not open to Negroes, and he said they understood that they were just driving through and that they were leaving then. Can you imagine being one of the kids on that bus? And your teacher shows you everything that's so beautiful about Tyler State Park, but you can't get out and have a picnic. You can't go to the water's edge. You have to just keep rolling. The next year, in 1950, Register, Presley, and Madlock came out again, asking if any provisions had been added for blacks, but Palmer told them no. For the rest of the spring, the park manager had seen, well, at least a couple of cars a week with Negroes in them driving through the park. On one occasion, a white man drove up with 2 Negroes and inquired about fishing. He indicated that he wanted to rent a boat for himself and the 2 Negroes to fish, and I explained to him that facilities were not open to Negroes. He said he was with them, and if they could not fish, he would not. In May of 1950, Modern Motor Company from Gladewater had a picnic in the park, and they brought their Negro employees with them on the picnic. The Negroes on this party were at one area in the park, and the white folks were in an adjoining area. The white folks served the Negroes their food, which seemed to bother him. I talked to Mr. Long of Gladewater, the owner of the company, and told him that Negroes were not allowed in the park. He explained to me that he was under the impression that from what he had read in the paper that the park was open to everyone. Paper had a way of meaning everyone just means white folks, He also said that he would get them out of the park as soon as he possibly could, which he did. Every day or so for the following month, there have been cars with Negroes coming in and out of the park. However, none of them have parked or gotten out of the cars. Under the increasing pressure from both the lawsuit and from area African Americans, the State Parks Board developed a budget for what it would cost to upgrade the parks to include blacks. In this proposal, Tyler was to get a small dam, a small dam, road work, a shelter, latrines, a disposal system, picnic areas, and baseball diamonds for $30,000. Another proposal outlined 5 concrete picnic tables and grills, water, shelter, and toilet facilities, an athletic field, playground equipment, roads, and utilities to total $20,800. But again, no funding was actually provided. In September 1950, Register and the others filed an amended complaint noting that blacks had been discriminated against in 36 state parks. Attorney General Price Daniel countered with a motion to dismiss, stating that the board was following the law that had just passed. Register then filed a second amended complaint pointing out that blacks had been denied access to 8 parks on every day and date for a period of 3 years. Each and every park, each and every building, each and every facility, and each and every piece of equipment, and each and every portion of land embraced in said parks. At that point, the state pounced legally. Daniel filed for a clarification because the suit did not list the parks, the circumstances, the dates, or the people specifically involved, other than the incident in Tyler. He had to have something very specific, and the amendment had not been specific enough. And Tyler State Park had been closed indefinitely on September 5th to all citizens, black and white. So there was no longer any discrimination at Tyler State Park because nobody got to enter. A week later, the federal judge in Austin ruled that he would not hear the case until after a state court ruled on the law. And the case was never refiled because there was no faith that a favorable ruling, if obtained, would be enforced by the state. Still hoping for a follow-up lawsuit, Jonas L. Jewett, educator and contributor to the Tyler Tribune, a black-owned newspaper, wrote, "It is a crying shame, people, yet this is no time to weep but to fight. Letters have been sent to 200 of our citizens asking to give or raise $5 each. There are 60,000 acres of the most picturesque state parks, 40 in number right here in Texas, which are as much off limits to our people as the Garden of Eden." He wanted our people to learn what a great document the Constitution of this United States is. Negroes should stop asking for some muddy, shallow end of some lake for their children to swim when they can get the whole lake for a fight. Those who handle projects where our tax and federal money go will be made to realize that they can be made to do things because the founders of this government fixed it that way. We fellows who push wheelbarrows around here can scrape and dig a few $1,000s and win cases before the Supreme Court. Yet the powers that be can raise enough money to choke up Niagara Falls only to lose. Old man Jim Crow is down in the ring and the count is 9. $1,000 from Tyler will give him one good belly punch. That will put him out of Texas in the next 2 years. The only way for us to get justice is to put up a fight and make them open the whole show and take over our lakes and parks like Herman Marion Sweat did, the University of Texas. In January of 1951, a state Senate committee recommended creating the previously suggested separate area of Tyler State Park, along with 2 new black state parks, parts of 3 others, and the cabins, group camp, fishing, and picnic areas at Caddo Lake State Park. On July 25th, a new road was authorized to connect Tyler State Park northwest to FM 2015, very close to the intersection of Lavender Road, a distance of 0.95 miles. Additional funds were evidently found because of July 4th of that